Hi all. So I just wanted to make this quick video walking through creating your MIDI mapping for Max. This is hopefully going to be a document that will maintain itself. I'm not planning on changing the MIDI mapping anymore after this, but this is just to help you get through, and you only have to do this once. So here I am, and I'm going to open MidiMonitor, and it's going to ask me right away for a MIDI mapping. So I'm going to pretend like I don't have a MIDI mapping already set. So I'm just going to hit cancel a whole bunch, and I'm going to get this screen. So to get out of this screen, we have to go out of presentation mode, which is right here. So just two different modes that Max has, kind of similar to how you unlock and lock things. So once I'm out of presentation mode, I can see my MIDIMonitor patch. If I double click on our MIDI ports, they're going to be in their default states right now. And I'm going to configure this to use my Akai nano key. Is it Akai? I forget who makes it. Korg nano key. So the first thing we're going to do is double check our coal. I'm going to double click this and notice that it's empty. I probably want to start with this being empty right now. If for some reason there's something in here, you can just select, delete it, and then when you close this, it's going to ask to validate. And double click it again just to make sure it's empty. One quick word, if you have this window open and then you edit this document by going through these steps, this view will not change, right? So if I go in here and I select my MIDI import, and I go back to that window that's already open, nothing happened. But if I close this and reopen it, I'll see that change. So just to give you a sign, this isn't a live preview. It doesn't update when you edit this call, which is what we're doing. So I selected my input port, which is my MIDI instrument, and I'm going to select my output port, which is going to be from Max 1. Whoops, there we go. From Max 1, and when I double click this, I should see those populated in here. I'm going to go ahead and close that. Go over here, and I'm going to update my mapping for my pads. Now, I have 8 pads on my instrument, like a lot of people do, and everything that we're working with right now is basically oriented around 8 pads and 8 dials. So if you have more pads, you can feel free to add more pads to your mapping. Similarly, if you have more dials, you can feel free to add more dials to your mapping, and some of the instruments we're using will take advantage of those. But for now, I'm just going to add 8 because that's what I have. You just change the number just by doing that, right? So I'm going to update my note mapping. I'm going to click here, and I'm going to play my 8 pads, just one at a time. So you'll notice when I play my pads, we'll see MIDI notes change. And I don't know if you noticed, but I played my pads kind of in order, and the MIDI note numbers were kind of random. So this is the reason why we're doing this, is everybody's pads have different MIDI note assignments, and they're not always in a consistent way. So we're just trying to create a consistent format for everyone so that our pads will work in the same way. So now I've done that, I can double click my coal, and I'll see all of my MIDI notes set up here. This number right here is going to be some arbitrary number, which is actually a combination of the MIDI note number as well as the MIDI channel. So don't worry too much about what that is. Just make sure you have those notes in there. You don't really even have to look in there if you don't want to. Note, by the way, that these 3 coals are named the same thing and so have the same information. They're actually sharing the same data. Okay, now I'm going to do my CC mapping. So I'm going to select here. I've got 8 knobs or dials on my MIDI controller. I'm going to again just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And notice that turns off when you've mapped all 8 of them. I'm going to double click the coal, and you'll see these are here with a negative number. So the CC numbers will always have a negative index, and the pads will always have a positive index. So I'm done. I've mapped 8 pads and 8 dials. I'm going to save my MIDI mapping, and I can call it Ian's test mapping, and I can close this patch. Now, when I go to Emily.master, it's going to ask me for where my MIDI mapping is. So I'm going to select Ian's test mapping. Right now, it just keeps asking it like 3 times. I don't know why. I can't make it stop doing that. So just hit it 3 times. Now notice that these don't change. But if you double click on this, it should say the correct output port and the correct input port. Uh-oh, I've got a problem. Why is that? Well, it turns out, and I guess, let me close this and go back to MIDIMonitor so we can see it. It turns out that, I am going to load that mapping here. So test mapping. There we go. Here's the mapping. For whatever reason, this drop-down menu has my nano key, but over here, it's called something different. And it's super annoying that it does this, but for whatever reason, this actually says something different than this does. So that sort of drop-down trick that I did to add the input port didn't work. All I have to do is double-click this, and I can just type in it. So it said, I believe it was keyboard/control was the correct thing. I'm going to close this and validate it, and then I'm going to save it, and it's going to replace the previous file. So you can just go in here and just edit all this stuff just with your keyboard. If you want to fix anything, you're welcome to do that. Particularly the names of your input and output ports is something that happens a lot. Okay, so I'm going to close that, go back over to Emily Master again, select my test mapping 3 times, and now if I double click on my note in, it should select the correct input port by default. The nice thing about this is once you've selected that MIDI mapping, by the way, here's the MIDI mapping again, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. This is just for double checking that everything's set correctly. And you can ignore these because these aren't actually correct. If for some reason you want to switch which MIDI mapping you're using, you can load MIDI mapping right there. So hopefully that will get you up and running and get you a MIDI mapping that will work for you. Again, if you have more than 8 pads or more than 8 buttons, 8 pads or 8 dials, that might actually be useful. And we'll see in the A155 instrument that actually is the ability to use more than 8 pads and dials in that patch.